Where do things go sideways? What are the things that always get screwed up when they're looking to make that leap?
AI drift, which means I've got Claude at home. I've got ChatGPT. I use Grok. I use this to go to work and then start dumping documents from their workplace. IBM said Watson has figured out when somebody's about to quit. This is where the maturity comes in. You get everybody in HR just gasped. Counterintuitively, it's actually giving more time is worse. Parkinson's law. So people ascribe a level of complexity to a request based on the time you're given to do it.
Whether you're starting out with AI or you're mature in AI, one of the things that's critical for every organization to have clearly defined is what are the rules of the road? What are the minimum viable guardrails that we need to adhere to before we launch headfirst into this initiative? And whenever you're thinking about the world of AI, one of the things that you often notice is that there seems to be a mad dash to just get something in play. And when you're often operating with a level of urgency and not having planned the step-by-step process, that can often get you in trouble. Now, what trouble looks like for a startup is going to be different than what it looks like for a more mature organization. But regardless of where you are in your AI journey, understanding what the guardrails should look like for your stage of development is a critical part of the process in successfully implementing AI. And that's what we're going to cover today. In today's conversation, we're going to take a look at what the governance model should consider when you're early in your AI journey and what the governance model should include when you're more mature as an AI organization. So the person that's going to guide us through that conversation is joining us today. Bob St-Jacques is a people, culture, and digital transformation executive. He's an international employment lawyer, university professor, and keynote speaker with 30 years of experience scaling and modernizing organizations across 29 countries and 11 industries. He's built, optimized, and digitally transformed 11 people and culture functions and led 42 HR technology implementations with deep expertise in distributed and hybrid operating models. He currently serves as the VP of People at Apera AI, and he's supporting rapid growth while strengthening global people systems governance and cross-border employment frameworks. Bob is a fellow with the Center for Evidence-Based Management and brings an evidence-based, metrics-driven approach to hiring, performance, and organizational design. Bob, welcome to the show.
All right. Thank you, Jim.
I'm looking forward to this conversation, and that's going to be a kind of an odd thing to say considering that we're going to be talking governance model. Now, before anybody clicks off, this is going to be a good conversation, so you want to stick around, especially in the context of AI and HR and building an AI initiative that adheres to governance models and how you actually do that right. So don't click away. So with that being said, I want to set the stage here and get a little bit more detail behind your story and some of the things that you've been involved in throughout your career that sets the stage for this governance conversation that we're going to have. Bob, why don't you share with the class some of the ins and outs of your career and story and how that leads into the governance conversation that we're going to have today?
All right. Thanks for that, Jim. So my career in terms of as it relates to HR started a couple years ago. And so we've got to go back to the early 90s where I worked in the Parliament of Canada drafting labor legislation, much of which is still in place today. I worked with a bunch of folks called lawyers and decided, hey, they got stuff done. So went to law school and practiced international labor and employment law. As happens to many of us, I was hired by one of my clients, which was LensCrafters at the time, and thus began our career. So I've worked in Fortune 150 companies, then relocated overseas to Dubai and worked for, as you could probably imagine, in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, Dubai was a hyper growth area. So got the test there. And since then, I've been mostly working with startups and tech companies in Southeast Asia and here in Vancouver since about 2017. In that time, what I've done is combined my passions, so to speak. So first of all, it's the employment law aspect. Secondly, it's the scale-up aspect. We're looking at digital transformations. And lastly, what brings a lot of this together is creating systems, not just a one-off project, not an email, but to put together systems so that anything that is improved or optimized is sustainable and continues to be in place long after I leave in those areas. And what I've learned, especially starting in Dubai, you could imagine the change management aspect of trying to tell a company that's had 300% growth for the past 3 years that they're quote unquote leaving money on the table. So I had to change the way I did things and pitch things. And so that's where I learned about the importance of systems and putting structure together.
So, one of the interesting things about what you described is that you're typically working with scale up organizations or organizations going through a digital transformation. One of the things that I would imagine that would be challenging, especially in a scale up environment, is that scale ups are a little bit different than startups. I usually work in the early stage startup phase where it's run fast and break things. And then when you enter into a scale up, you have to put in a lot more operational rigor. And the thing that I'm curious about is from your perspective as somebody that's putting in systems and processes, how do you get around, or what's your process for getting around some of the resistance to those things, especially when you're talking about a culture that's on the cusp of transitioning from a true startup environment to a scale up environment, which are two completely different things, in my opinion, as far as the wiring and the makeup of the people that work there, and maybe even some of the cultural things.
Yeah. And in terms of visualizing that in the beginning, right? So pretty much when your startup is usually linear growth, right? You've got a trajectory that's really nice. When you get to scale up, it starts to hockey stick to a certain extent. And thankfully, I went on Fiverr and I got a quick animation video done of basically when you're growing linearly, you can build scaffolding underneath and support that linear growth, and you can run fast and break things. When you're scaling up, that's typically exponential growth. And in order to have, I explain to people, it's almost like a half pipe in skateboarding. If you're going to go up like this, you're going to need strong scaffolding behind it. In other words, you've got to make sure that it's sustainable. You can maybe get away with it for a little while. So that's why I'm the kind of a little bit of the Debbie Downer comedian going, trust me on this one. It's like the old adage, right? If I had 1 hour to cut down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 to 5 minutes sharpening the axe. Putting in place the underlying systems and structures and understanding how communication really happens is how I get the buy-in initially to say, okay, build a system so we can run fast, minimizing friction.
So it makes sense building in the scaffolding that you described. I'm curious how you get around the people aspect of it, because there's going to be people that are not big on coloring inside the lines. When I hear governance, that's what I think. Here's the sheet of paper that you can color within, and here are the lines that you need to stay within. So, from a change management perspective or a behavior change perspective, what are the conversations that you need to have to shift behavior and thinking from wide open green fields to freedom within fences?
Yeah. So the way I tend to describe, I used a car analogy. And again, in startups, it's typically you've just got the gas pedal. And so basically, what I'm saying is that things are about to get a little bit more complicated. There's going to be turns in the road. We might have to go off road. So we're going to need a steering wheel, going to need brakes in those areas. And maybe we're going to need a little bit of enhancement and automation. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But it's just understanding in order to go real fast in challenging situations, you do need a bit of structure and guidelines. And so I use various analogy depending on the culture and which part of the world I'm in at the time and the type of organization. I try to lock it into the industry that they're in, but typically the car example is a good one. That it's you're much more in control if you have a few things. And I'm not talking about airbags and things like that. Don't go overboard. I'm literally talking steering wheel, brakes, and a few others.
So that sets up the stage really well for the conversation that we're going to have, because we're going to talk about two different life cycle stages within organizations when it comes to AI. So let's take maybe the easier one to tackle, which would be an organization that's more immature in their AI journey. So if an organization, an HR leader is looking to just start out and implementing an AI strategy, what are the things that they should be thinking about at that startup stage of the AI journey within their organization?
Yeah, so I would put the answer into three buckets, right? So you've got use cases, data, and controls. So let's just go for a fairly simple use case, right? You're solo HR person, you've got a 100-person company, maybe you're operating in 2 or 3 countries, like mine. And so you've done some of the hard yards, right? You've got employee guidelines, you've got manager playbooks, we've got performance management playbooks, and so on and so forth. You have a lot of information. Even if you think about something as simple as benefits, right? I've got Canadian benefits, US benefits, Mexican benefits, Italian, German benefits, right? And all these are, and then I've got 100 employees and we're growing. So one of the easy use cases would be in what I call a green win, and I'll go to that in a second, which is this is basically one of the easier things you can do in the sense of you create an internal HR answer bot that only uses approved sources, right? So this has gone through the approval process. And for organizations, it depends, especially with just scale ups. You're probably looking at SOC 2 with Europeans with GDPR and some of those. Tie it all together. So I said use case. Okay, so we've got these, and you don't want to be answering these questions one at a time. It could help you. So what happens, right? So they go in, give an answer. So what are the data that you look at? Median time to the first response, median time to resolution, right? Because it's one thing for an AI to spit out a response. It's another thing for the person to say, awesome, I have the answer. We've got deflection rates, we've got reopen rates, right? Where the answer wasn't clear. So you get the data. And then lastly, it's the controls, right? So then you look at it weekly or monthly, depending on how many requests you get. How well is this working? And you iterate it through. So that would be one of the very simple and what I say relatively as close as you get to risk-free usage of AI in a startup.
So I get that. And you and I tend to be having these sorts of conversations all the time. But I want to go back to something that you mentioned. You want to identify your green win. If you don't know what you don't know, how do you know what a green win looks like? So share some of the characteristics or identifiers of what a green win looks like, that low risk implementation win using AI. What you mentioned one use case. What are some of those other use cases that you need to think about? Or maybe even what are some of the other problems that an HR leader needs to be examining to identify what's the greenest of the green win within the environment?
Correct. So this is where you're looking for two things. It is based on data that you internally and intrinsically control. I'm talking policies, processes, procedures, and they can be in Confluence, they could be in Jira, they can be in your service, but it's documents you've created and you're limiting the AI to that space and the responses. The second piece is oversight. In other words, it doesn't spit out answers automatically. It preps an answer, and then you click agree and send, and you're able to edit those. If you have those two elements, I would say that tends to put it in the green. I would also add in third piece there where it doesn't make any decisions. In other words, it doesn't say, hey, if somebody says, hey, is orthodontics covered under our dental benefits? And it spits out a no answer. Sometimes you want a bit more nuance than that and say, typically no. However, in the case where there's an underlying medical condition, blah, 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 right? This is where a lot of AI tends to miss the nuance and you make sure that it doesn't have any final decision-making say on that. So again, internal documentation, review, and you want to stay away from it making final decisions.
So that's a really good framework. Just recapping data and internal control, oversight over the output, and then decision control where the platform isn't making decisions. The way that translates to my head when I'm thinking about this is human in the lead versus full automation is how I consider this falling in. When you look at those three things that you just mentioned, what is it about those three things that make it a safe play if you're early in your AI journey?
This is where the external piece comes in. Your listeners may have heard at this point, right? There are several ongoing lawsuits against very big players, Workday, Eightfold, HireVue, and so on. And if you look at the crux of those complaints, and they dive deep into one case, it's about California consumer laws. So it's very legalistic. However, let's pull back, and I'm a pragmatic person. I learned early on in my legal career, you don't say no, you say, where do you want to go and help the client find a way to get there. So I'm going to help the listeners find a way to get there. Yes, it's a big, scary world out there and people are getting sued. However, we've got to do business. And so by putting those buckets together, what I call the green area, is that those items are not susceptible to regulation and compliance regimes. And so that's why with those, you want to stay very narrow within those. It's internal. I'm reviewing it and it never has a final say.
I think when I hear all that, the TLDR that comes to mind is set it up in a way where you're mitigating your risk of getting sued, especially when you're talking about the Workday example and the eightfold example. Now that's solid stuff. When you think about those three criteria to set up sort of some basic guardrails, as you're setting those things up, what are additional considerations that they need to factor in as they're building this model?
Yeah. And so this is where you mentioned it earlier, right? About humans taking the lead, or I've talked about collaborative intelligence, which is imagine having a great PhD chief of staff or personal assistant, right? They're brilliant. They just don't know a lot about the real world. And so you need to lead it. You know your organization better than it does, and so on and so forth. And so that's why it's very important to have that level of control. And so when you structure it this way, you can start moving down the line, right? So I gave the example of HR service. Let me give you another specific example. What about a questionnaire on a job in a job application process? And so typically people ask questions. And then, by the way, this would be a yellow or a red. Don't do this. Take people's answers and just ask some AI to evaluate people and rank them. Do not do that. What you can do, remember, we're talking about control and documentation. If you have a rubric that says there's 4 answers that you can choose from, this answer is the best one, right? And so it can correct for you. But remember, let's go back to basics, or I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible because you created the question, you created the answers, you identified the correct answer. All it's doing is grading for you. It's like a Scantron from back in the 90s on exams. So that's the level you're going at and staying in the beginning, right? So if you look at almost every part of the employee life cycle, so whether it's workforce planning or even employer branding, recruitment, onboarding all the way through, if you focus on those 3 buckets, make sure it's you. And I want to highlight that difference, right? Between you writing questions, you writing the answer, you identifying the right answer, and they're telling you if it matches versus, hey, I've got 10 people typing in answers, or people answered 10 questions and typing in the answers, and just rank these people against each other. That is a definite yellow, red, and we can get into those in a second. By focusing on the 3 areas, you can stay solidly in the green.
Got it. Now, I want you to think through the process of building this out. So when you're looking at that early stage of the AI journey and they're putting in a governance model of sorts, where do organizations get themselves into trouble? What are the pitfalls that they need to watch out for that is going to set them up for fail as they become bigger?
Yeah. This is where you're asking AI to make a decision on, compare and contrast, not against a solid set rubric, right? Because you don't need compare and contrast here. You're scoring people, right? Again, it's like Scantron. You fill in the bubble sheets, right? There's a right and wrong answer. Time you're asking for levels of analysis and nuance and so on, that's where you get into trouble. Here's the reason. We get a little bit legalistic. What's the big deal, right? I'm just comparing people. Actually, it's a big deal because both in Europe and in North America, the US and Canada and even Mexico, anytime you have technology, digital technology spitting out a decision, and here's the law that they're using to sue Eightfold and Workday, it's the consumer protection laws. So typically, if you get a credit score and it's bad and they turn you down and the information is false, you can sue them. That's what these lawsuits are relying on. So that's why I'm saying you want to back up as far as possible and make sure there's almost 2 levels there where you review the work and you don't let it make a decision, right? You have to a bit manually, or you have to click on some level where the human is making the decision. Once you have technology spitting out a decision, think about it. Somebody doesn't get a job. Well, that's a financial loss, right? And this is how these lawsuits are coming about. So again, don't worry about that because it's a bit complex and dry. Consumer protection laws, you can imagine, in the US, there's thousands of pages of it. Again, focusing on your own data from yourself and making sure that you're reviewing, making sure that you're making the final decision and can defend it.
So I'm going to throw out a hypothetical, and I want to go back to a version of what you described earlier. So let's say that you're going through the hiring process, and part of the hiring process includes a writing sample, and you're answering a question. Everybody's answering the same question to a writing sample.
Sure.
You've built a style guide internally that says this is what the ideal answer looks like. This is what a good answer looks like. This is okay. So you have all of these inbound candidates that are applying, going through the application process, submitting a writing sample, and then you take those writing samples and you apply it against a style guide and have the AI do an analysis and stack rank the top 4 candidates against the style guide. Am I thinking about having that as a green process the right way? And if not, what are the holes in how I'm thinking about it so that it can be a tight process that doesn't set a candidate, that doesn't exclude a candidate that should be included in the process?
Yeah. These use cases are where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So in your case, you're doing well. So you've got the style guide, it's yours, you've anchored it, you've already decided what excellent looks like, good looks like, fair looks like, poor looks like, say it's 4 levels. You can put that into AI. I know as a university professor, right? We do it. The first screening is done through AI. However, that's where it needs to stop. The part where you said stack rank them, no. Okay, you can do that. It will give you a score, right? So you score it. So, section 1, they need to mention 1, 2, 3. If they mention 2 out of 3, well, they get 66%. Section 2, section 3, section 4, and so on, all the way through. You will get a score. You personally, individual, as a human being, then look at that, right? You could sort it in Excel, right? If you could export it to Excel, okay, this person scored out of 40 a 36. You just sort it out. 36 is first, 32 is second, and so on. You cannot ask AI to compare and contrast. Okay. You want it one-to-one with AI, right? This AI evaluated this person. Forget about everybody else. Our AI that we use evaluated this person. Forget everybody else, right? And then you get a score, and then you look at the score and say, okay, I'm reading this, I validate it. Yes, I agree on the score. And then so you're very good up until the last piece where you asked it to stack rank, because then you're asking it to make a subjective decisions, unless you say, just rank them, but that would be the same as doing a sort in Excel.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Now, when you think about the governance decisions and building out those frameworks, what are the key or what are the critical components that every HR leader should be thinking about when they're early in that start in the AI journey? Most important things that they need to keep in mind as they're building this model.
Yeah. So the first piece is, I would say, company confidentiality. So right now, what we have is what we call in the industry AI drift, which means I've got Claude at home. I've got ChatGPT. I use Grok. I use this. They go to work and then start dumping documents from their workplace. Yes, I'm sure it'll make you analyze things more quickly. However, again, depending on your settings, and this is where people are not always aware of the settings and how it's important in terms of privacy, some of the information that gets out. Also, you've got to be aware of where you are in the world. There are, for example, in New York City, there are specific New York City AI use laws. Colorado has a very specific AI use laws, right? So we've got AI drift, we've got where are we located, and then the next piece is looking at what is the maturity level of individuals. And I'll give you an example of the last one. I don't know if you remember, it was about 3-4 years ago, and there was a huge press release, and IBM said, Watson has figured out when somebody's about to quit. This is where the maturity comes in, right? Everybody in HR just gasped. And by the way, that went directly, it didn't go to HR, it went directly to the person's manager. Not everybody's going to be able to handle that with the nuance and finesse that it requires. So it's understanding your organization, the maturity level, right? If you're working in, for example, consulting engineering, these people are masters and doctorates. a little bit more mindset, a little bit more structure. If you're dealing with more of a retail startup environment where things are young people, it's fun, it's chaotic, or fast moving consumer goods, Red Bull, right? In their startup phase, you heard a lot of great stories out of Austria back in the day. Those folks, I would say, start being ready to really clamp down. So look at those three first pieces, especially in terms of where you are, because that could really constrict what type of AI you use and for what reasons.
This has been a fantastic conversation so far. If you haven't already done so, make sure to join our community. We're building a network of the most forward-thinking HR and people operations professionals who are defining the future. I will personally be sharing news and ideas around how we can all thrive in the age of AI. You can find it at gocleary.com/Cleary-community. Now back to the show.
I'm going to resist the urge, being a retention and turnover guy, to go down in the turnover intention rabbit hole that you just opened the door for. So I'm going to not take the bait, but that would be an interesting conversation. So now I want you to fast forward. So right now we've been talking about building governance models for organizations that are early in their AI journey. Now let's think about let's think about those organizations that are maturing as far as their AI initiatives and implementations are going. When you think about that maturing organization, what needs to shift from that early stage model to be relevant in that accelerating growth or maturing model?
I guess you would think about it almost like an employee, right? So in the past, when we used to develop employees, we used to turn people into T-shaped employees, right? So the vertical part of the T is your depth of knowledge in your craft. And the top of the T, the horizontal part, is the breadth, right? And how it goes in. Think about it that way. You're creating a more T-shaped AI governance environment, which means it goes much deeper in the sense that what are the requirements? For example, with utilities in Western Canada and the Western United States, you have WEC, Western Electric Cooperative, which has very strong opinions in terms of cybersecurity and some of those areas, how it relates to AI. So it's not only where you are, whether you're partly owned by the government, and you also have these overarching, sometimes multinational regulatory frameworks to come in. So this is what I mean by depth, right? You start really going deep into your organization because you have many more stakeholders and touch points. In terms of the top level of the T, this is where you get into some of the more nuanced examples and where data collection optimization is much more important, right? Because at a small company, it's like, yeah, my bad. Sorry, it's going to take a day longer to get you an answer. When you're talking about 5,000 employees in 10 countries, and answers need to come at people more quickly, you need a much more robust, what we call like an HR knowledge-based triage and caseware summaries. So then you're building service levels with review after review and so on. So it's a bit more bureaucratic, right? Because there needs to be more redundancies and fail safes in these areas because giving one employee the wrong answer could cascade, right? And turn into a precedent. Oh, Bill got $500. Why am I not getting $500? Well, that was an error. Meanwhile, you've got 200 employees with their hand up asking for that $500 as well. So you see, it's the scale of that. So I'm trying to simplify it and be pragmatic to our HR folks. And yeah, just think about it of just dramatically deepening your vertical T and dramatically widening the top of your T.
So I want to apply what you said, specifically when you're talking about redundancies and fail safes, and apply a specific use case to it. So in a more mature organization, a lot more people, there's a lower fault tolerance when it comes to errors because one error can be duplicated across an organization and really incur some pretty big costs. Let's apply it to the use case of a chatbot because it seems like a lot of HR organizations look at that as low-hanging fruit to implement to clear off some of the load on their individual plates. And you have a chatbot in place, you have employees asking it questions, the chatbot might be producing answers or creating tickets for HR to deal with. And when it's doing that, we all know that no matter how well your prompt is designed, your AI has a tendency to go off the rails here and there and just invent things. So how do you structure redundancies and fail safes in something that seems fairly low level, but the implication of getting something wrong can be massive in a larger organization. So how do you build a fail-safe around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is where, honestly, I spend a lot of my time. So it comes down to training the AI that you use, right? So if you're in a Microsoft environment, use Copilot, Google environment, Gemini. Now, very specifically to that, for example, and when I'm doing training, people always say, hey, I just typed in the same prompt you did and I got a completely different answer than you. I was like, yeah, I've been training my AI for since 2023. And I'm also, I got the 25 year in review and I'm a top 3% ChatGPT user, right? So I've had a lot of conversations, over 2,900 conversations. And so I've tweaked and dialed it down. Now, the biggest one for me is I'm a fellow in the Center for Evidence-Based Management. And as part of my commitment to that organization is I can't say what I think, I can only say what I can prove. And that means there needs to be a citation. Let's go back to the chatbot example. What you will have to do is say, you cannot just pop up a sentence. It needs to be quoted verbatim from the text I uploaded, and there needs to be a link to give to the employee. So the employee clicks on it and expands the actual document itself. They read it and they're responsible for their own interpretation. So I don't allow my AIs to freelance, guess, moonlight, hallucinate, whatever you want to call it. I force it to be like a professor, right? Where is your source? Where is the citation? You cannot give any answers unless there's a citation to the document I gave you in this instance.
So I'm grinning because I think all of us have had the experience when working with various LLMs where they'll produce a source, but the source is just completely made up. And the added layer of forcing the master prompt to produce a link that goes to the source that's being cited, I think that's a really good, simple way of like pressure testing or validating the actual evidence that's being provided. At the same time, I was thinking through that, I had a flashback to my doctoral program where the instructor was like, in God we trust, everyone else must produce evidence with multiple citations. Nobody cares what you think, only care about what you can prove or cite back to research that's already been done. So thanks for that flashback. Continuing on this thread, we've talked about building in redundancies and fail safes, which becomes critical in larger organizations and as you mature your AI practice. What are the things that you should be retiring as you mature as an AI organization? There are a certain set of rules that apply when you're in that startup stage or in that early stage. What should be the things that you get rid of as you become more mature in the AI practice within your enterprise?
The way I've worked it, I've tried it bottom up and I've tried it top down. And then let me be a bit more specific. So in terms of bottom up, you tend to open up information, right? It's very similar to normal policies and procedures. Back in the day, we used to hand people a handbook, right? With all the nice, pretty pictures, and they had to sign the back page and rip it out saying they've read it and understood it. So it's very similar to new processes using. Once people develop a certain level of maturity, you've then moved it back, right? So that everybody onboarding gets that level of training. Okay, so you've taken care of everybody's here. You locked it in several cycles, and you'll be able to go through and analyze some of the information. Okay, how many errors are going? As that happens, you start delayering it, right? In that area and giving people direct access to information as you go through. I've tried it top down. So as I've trained managers in that area and empowering them. So they tend to use it, right, as a tool. So as you grow your managers, as you train them, as you develop them, because thinking back to the startup, you're getting some, yeah, they may have had experience somewhere else, but once you get them up to a certain level, start taking off the training wheels and saying, actually, employees are going to come to you and ask you some hard questions. You, leader, will still have access to the information, and then it will help you. Here are standard answers coming through. This is the way you evolve it for the leaders. So instead of everything open to everyone and all these employees, you start empowering manager, which leads to sustainability, right? Because if you're the crutch forever, oh yeah, employee, don't bother me. with those kind of questions go to the chatbot versus, hey, you have a question about your career. Cool. Don't go to the HR site. Talk to me about it and help it out. So you can see what you're trying to do is as your leadership matures, as your employee base matures, with that, you start peeling away some of the layers and then moving up. Another good example is learning and development. In the beginning, what it will do is you set some algorithms. It'll say, hey, you're an iOS developer and Bill's also an iOS developer. So, and he took this course, so you should take this course too. Or 5 other people in your department took this course, you should too. That's level 1. Once you start getting that information and then you can start to automate it, then you move up the AI food chain, so to speak, where it suggests certain courses based on the set of competencies that are required for the next level. Hey, it'd be a good time, right, for you to spend the next year learning these 4 competencies, which will set you up well for this next level. So you can see how you just keep making things more challenging and mature with the organization.
I like the example that you just gave from an employee development perspective, where you have platforms that are integrated into, especially if you're mature as an organization and you have some sort of criteria that's established in terms of, for you to be a senior developer, you need to be able to do these measurable things, and these are the soft skills that you need to develop. And then you lump that in with your learning management platform that has a library that helps them shore that up. I really like that as far as taking some of the guesswork out of the employee development plan. And I think one of the things that a lot of organizations do wrong is that they say you're in charge of your own development. If you don't know how to go from point A to point B, where it's murky, how are you supposed to take charge of something that's not clear in the first place? So having a bit of an assist where it suggests learning paths for that individual, that actually helps the individual be more intentional. And if it's fed into sort of a one-on-one process with the manager, that actually gets the manager more actively developing their employees instead of leaving it up to the employees to actually develop themselves. I think that's one of the biggest crutches that exist in corporate America, is that you leave development to the employee when oftentimes you're not arming the employee with, what does the career path even look like? What's the hard criteria that I need to attain to get to the next level? So I really like that you brought, looks like you have something else to add to this. So I'll be quiet for a second.
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit, right? Because again, there's that pressure, hey, you've got to develop yourself. Or even sometimes it's that, hey, you're the manager, I'm holding you responsible. 20% of your bonus is based on herding cats in learning and development. Both of those are patently unfair. What AI can do is start bridging that gap, right? And nudging people along. And so the employee, it's okay, I'm good at these 4 competencies. These ones I've never tried before. So let me take courses and then click whatever they are live. But then after they do that, then the manager gets a message. Hey, did you know that Jim signed up for these 4 courses? He's going to do 1 per quarter over the next year. So that gives you something to talk about. That's the end. How's the course going? Can I help you with anything? You want to try it out? I've got a stretch project for you that will allow you to try skill competency 1 and 2 on that side. So you see how a lot of these AI pieces are trying to push both ends against the middle. But it's almost saying is, don't get too clever. Yeah, agentic AI is amazing, and we can touch on that later. But right now, putting in the basics, right? To what you're trying to do is use AI to nudge human behavior, right? It's, again, let's go back to collaborative intelligence. You're using it as I think with Notion, you've got second brains and things like that. Use it across the whole. Hey, you've got candidates to interview. Hey, 2 of your employees are taking courses. Hint, they're thinking about growth. Great. That doesn't mean they've got a foot out the door, right? Typically. And then you go through, hey, they're looking at the pay scales. Okay, so they're growth minded. They want to see how they can make more money. So it's about, again, pushing both ends against the middle and helping nudge human, or try to minimize human shyness, right? People are like, oh, what do we think to my boss? I don't want to be seen like the problem employee. What if it's AI going, hey, manager, employee over here is looking at these things and may want to pay attention.
Yeah, those nudges and prompts are actually a really good call out. And I like the other piece that you mentioned, and I think I want to highlight it, which is bridging the gap between theory and execution. So if we're talking about that learning management use case where it's informing the ecosystem about, hey, your employees here and here are taking these courses, that as a manager, and especially at the line level manager space where you probably got a battlefield promotion, you have no coaching or training on how to actually be a manager, those sort of prompts that say, hey, you have a certain percentage of your employee population that are taking these courses. What assignments or initiatives do you have that you can delegate, which would be a stretch goal for them, help them move what they're learning into actual practice and give you an opportunity to coach in real time and build your skills that way as well. I think that's a really important call out that gets missed, especially at that line level manager tier in a lot of organizations. So really good stuff here. I want you to put your Debbie Downer hat back on.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at organizations that are at the more mature stage of their AI journey and they're looking at getting to the next level from an AI initiative perspective, where do things go sideways? What are the things that always get screwed up or most often get screwed up when they're looking to make that leap?
It's in the area of AI autonomous decision making. Here's what happens. You've got 2000 trying to do performance management. You've got either quarterly reviews, annual reviews, right? You're gathering all this information. So you've asked employees to write their self-evaluation. You've asked them to get one or two peers. You've asked their manager. So you've got 2,000 employees times 4 documents each. Come on, we're only human, right? So then all of a sudden you get into that gray area. Just compare them, right? And it's that slippery slope where it comes down, right? So this is where folks come in, they're overwhelmed. I have spent many 2, 3 a.m.s in the morning with my HR team globally trying to finish performance reviews, do it the hard way in Excel and compare and contrast, review each manager's, making sure there's equity within the department, within the country, within the group, and so on and so forth, right? And it's the human. Sometimes a lot of HR folks and managers are overwhelmed and they just click the easy way. Hey, ChatGPT, hey, you compare and contrast my 5 employees. And that's where it gets them into trouble, right? So it's then taking that nudge and pushing that nudge too far, right? And saying, oh, becoming codependent on the AI piece and having AI make a decision. My budget for increases is $112,000 for 4 employees. How should I distribute it based on these 4 reviews? Okay, that you're in the right, okay? Because you're asking AI to make pay decisions based on subjective review of 4 reviews.
So when I hear that example, it almost strikes me as a root cause of that sort of scenario is poor planning. Because if you're leaving everything to the last minute, that's when you're forced into those corners. Now, some of that stuff, because we know HR, can't be helped because there's always a fire to be fought somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it too. I would imagine a better comms plan and more accountability through the manager tiers to get these things done on time or delivered on time would probably mitigate. I might be in an ideal world scenarioing this, but I think that's how you get yourself in trouble is leaving everything in the last minute.
Yeah, and counterintuitively, it's actually giving more time is worse. Parkinson's law, right? So people ascribe a level of complexity to a request based on the time you're given to do it, right? For an employee, we're doing quarterly. It should take me to write a review, right? Especially if you're doing it quarterly, you're having one-on-ones, whatever, on that side. And if you're giving 2 weeks to do it, it's due. And then HR is working all over weekend trying to collate everything together. And that's, again, where mistakes get made or the manager, I have reviews on the Friday. So typically what I do is say, no, you've got 3 days to do it. Monday to Wednesday, and it can slip into that first Friday. You play catch up, and then I've got the next week. So exactly to your point, but the one piece I wanted to add in was Parkinson's law. Giving more time is actually counterproductive.
Great conversation so far. And I think we learned a lot, especially when we're covering sort of 2 different business maturity stages when it comes to this. When you think about both sets of scenarios that we described, what are the biggest items that people need to pay attention to when they're looking at rolling out any sort of AI initiative, independent of stage of business development that they're in?
Yep. So I would do a 5-item checklist, which we've touched on before. So let's go. Number 1, AI use inventory. So every tool, every use case, and just make sure there's clarity on those, right? Hey, ChatGPT for everyone. No, absolutely not. Copilot for everyone. No, absolutely not. There needs to be guidance. Number 2, data boundaries. What can or cannot be put into that model? Okay. Tiers. So the green, yellow, red. Green, okay, pull HR information from our own playbook. Awesome. Yellow, getting into maybe some evaluative pieces in the recruitment process. Yeah, it's not great. Red, making decisions on pay. Okay, so let's understand the risk tiers. The next one is, you can't ignore this, human accountability. Who is the owner of that system and use case and process? And then the last piece, and I touched on this in the beginning because I'm a big data nerd, is measurement, right? So how long does it take to get an answer? How often are the answers correct or incorrect? How, and so on and so forth, so that you're constantly looking at. So use inventory, boundaries, risk tiers, the human accountability, and basic measurement.
Great stuff. I know that we're scratching the surface on both these fronts in terms of building governance models for organizations that are early in their AI journey and building governance models for organizations that are more mature. And I'm sure people will want to reach out to you. What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Best way is to link up with me on LinkedIn in terms of direct messages as well. I love nerding out, as you can probably tell. I enjoy talking about this subject and having chats with like-minded people because I'm on my own learning journey. Just this year, I started a doctorate in AI and ML because it became clear what I didn't know. It's quite massive. And so in order to be more helpful, right, to the organizations I work for, my peer community, to folks listening to podcasts like this, I took it as a duty to be better informed and to be more evidence-based. And rather than I think, now I could prove some of these ideas. And so on that side, happy to continue the discussion and to learn.
Awesome stuff. Thanks, Bob, for hanging out with us. Really good conversation. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to take away a lot of different things from the discussion. When I think about this conversation, I think the most foundational thing that everyone needs to keep in mind is defining what green looks like. And when we say green, it means a high impact, low risk element of implementing AI within your environment. And I think that's pretty important because when you think about any initiative, you need to understand what success looks like. And you also need to understand what the path to success looks like as well. And when you define a process as safe to implement, that puts you in a position to be successful. And I think defining that as a first step, whether you're a small organization or a large organization, is an important step for many organizations as they move in their AI journey. So when you're looking at where to get started and how to move things forward, defining what safe, predictable, and successful looks like is an important first step that every organization should consider before they get started in launching any major initiative. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. For those of you who've been listening to the conversation, we appreciate you hanging out. If you like the discussion, make sure you subscribe and follow the show, as well as leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player. And then tune in next time where we'll have another leader hanging out with us and sharing with us the insights that they picked up as they work on future-proofing HR.
Hey, it's Thomas again. One quick question before you go. Are you and your HR team tired of answering the same employee questions again and again in Slack? If yes, our Cleary AI-powered Slackbot is here to help. It takes routine employee requests and answers it automatically while freeing up time for you to take on more important tasks. At the same time, it automatically builds up an HR knowledge base as you go. It's quick to set up, works right in Slack, and you can try it for free. Just head on over to gocleary.com/HR-chatbot to install it. It's again, gocleary.com/HR-chatbot. Thanks again.